What do you say to a general who believes he can end a war in weeks if you'll just give him what he needs, when you know that saying yes might cost thousands of lives you're responsible for protecting? On September 22, 1944, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower sat across from Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr. in a drab headquarters building in Verdun, France, and faced exactly this question. Patton's Third Army had been racing across France at a pace that shocked even the most optimistic Allied planners, capturing territory faster than any army in modern warfare, liberating towns and cities with such speed that maps couldn't be updated quickly enough to track his progress. His armored columns had covered more ground in 6 weeks than the entire Allied advance in World War I had managed in 4 years. The spearheads of his divisions were now positioned along the German border, poised to crash through the Siegfried Line and drive straight into the industrial heartland of the Third Reich. Patton stood before Eisenhower that autumn morning with fire in his eyes, his ivory-handled pistols gleaming at his sides, and made a demand that would force Eisenhower into one of the most consequential decisions of the entire European campaign. He wanted tanks, fuel, ammunition, and bridging equipment, and he wanted them immediately. He believed, with absolute conviction, that if Eisenhower gave him priority for supplies over Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery in the north, he could punch through to the Rhine River, cross into Germany proper, and potentially end the war before Christmas. The tension in that room was thick enough to cut with a knife, because both men knew that the decision made in the next few minutes would determine the course of the war and possibly the fate of millions. If you're fascinated by the real decisions that shaped history, the moments when leaders had to choose between competing strategies with thousands of lives hanging in the balance, then subscribe to this channel right now because we dig into the actual conversations and conflicts that textbooks gloss over. Hit that like button if you want to see more content that brings you inside the rooms where history was made, and share this video with anyone who thinks they understand World War II but doesn't know the brutal choices commanders faced every single day. After you finish watching, leave a comment telling us what surprised you most about this story or what detail you never knew before, because the engagement helps us bring you more of these deep historical narratives that go beyond the surface-level facts everyone already knows. Now, to understand why this confrontation between Eisenhower and Patton mattered so much, you need to understand what had happened in the months leading up to that September meeting and why the entire Allied command structure was fracturing under the weight of success. After the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, the Allied armies had fought through the brutal hedgerow country of Normandy for nearly 2 months, suffering casualties that rivaled some of the worst fighting of the First World War, battering against German defenses that seemed impossible to break through. Then, in late July, Operation Cobra smashed through the German lines near St. Lo, and the breakthrough that followed changed everything. Patton's Third Army, activated on August 1, 1944, exploded through the gap and began one of the most spectacular advances in military history, racing eastward and then wheeling north to trap German forces in the Falaise pocket while simultaneously sending columns driving toward Paris and beyond. By August 25, Paris was liberated, and by early September, Patton's forward elements had crossed the Meuse River and were approaching the Moselle, covering distances that should have taken months in a matter of weeks. American newspapers back home were running headlines calling Patton unstoppable, and the American public began to believe that the war might genuinely be over by the end of the year, that their sons and husbands might be home for Christmas. But success brought a problem that no amount of tactical brilliance could solve, and that problem was logistics. The Allied supply chain was still running from the beaches of Normandy and the makeshift port facilities along the French coast, because the major French ports had either been destroyed by the Germans or were still held by German garrisons that refused to surrender. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every tank track, every K-ration that reached the front lines had to be trucked hundreds of miles from the coast over roads that were never designed to handle such traffic, and the famous Red Ball Express truck convoys were pushing their vehicles and drivers to the absolute limit of human endurance. By September, the supply situation had become critical, and Eisenhower faced an impossible choice between 2 competing strategies that both promised victory but required resources that simply didn't exist in sufficient quantities to support both simultaneously. In the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British 21st Army Group, was proposing Operation Market Garden, an audacious plan to use airborne forces to seize bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands and open a route into northern Germany that would bypass the Siegfried Line entirely. Montgomery argued that a concentrated thrust in the north, given absolute priority for supplies and reinforcements, could end the war by Christmas and prevent the Germans from organizing any effective defense. In the south, Patton was arguing for exactly the opposite approach, insisting that his Third Army was already in position to break through into Germany, that the German forces facing him were on the verge of collapse, and that all he needed was fuel and ammunition to continue the momentum that had carried him across France. Eisenhower, sitting at his headquarters in Granville and later Versailles, had to weigh these competing claims while also managing the political pressures from Washington and London, the personality conflicts between his subordinate commanders, and the cold mathematical reality of supply tonnages and transportation capacity. The meeting in Verdun on September 22 wasn't the first time Patton had pressed his case, but it was the most intense confrontation between the two men over the supply issue. Patton arrived at the conference convinced that Eisenhower was favoring Montgomery for political reasons, believing that the Supreme Commander was too concerned with maintaining Allied unity and keeping the British happy to make the militarily sound decision that would actually win the war. He had already been ranting to his staff for weeks about what he saw as timid, bureaucratic thinking that was squandering the opportunity his army had created through aggressive action and battlefield success. When he entered the conference room that morning, he was prepared to make his case with every ounce of persuasive power he could muster, and everyone present knew that Patton in full rhetorical flight was a force of nature that could overwhelm almost anyone. Eisenhower, for his part, was dealing with pressures that Patton either didn't see or chose to ignore, including direct communications from Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, concerns about maintaining alliance cohesion, intelligence reports about German defensive preparations, and the simple arithmetic of supply tonnages that couldn't be changed by force of will or tactical brilliance. The room included several other officers, among them Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, Patton's immediate superior and commander of the 12th Army Group, who found himself caught between his friendship with Patton and his responsibility to execute Eisenhower's broader strategic vision. As Patton laid out his argument, he painted a picture of opportunity that would never come again, of German forces in disarray, of a clear path to the Rhine and beyond, of a chance to end the war in 1944 and save countless lives by preventing a winter campaign and the prolonged fighting that would surely come if the Allies allowed the Germans time to reorganize and fortify their positions. Patton's argument was built on several key assumptions that seemed reasonable based on what he was seeing from his position at the front, but that looked different from Eisenhower's theater-wide perspective. He genuinely believed that the German army was on the verge of total collapse, that one more hard push would shatter their ability to resist and send them reeling back in such disarray that organized defense would become impossible. He pointed to the speed of his advance, the numbers of prisoners being taken, the abandoned equipment his forces were finding, and the increasingly desperate German counterattacks that seemed more like death throes than coherent military operations. He argued that every day of delay gave the Germans time to bring up reinforcements, to organize defensive lines, to prepare the fortifications of the Siegfried Line for serious resistance, and to mobilize the German population for total war in defense of the homeland. Time, Patton insisted, was the most precious resource they had, more valuable than fuel or ammunition or tank replacements, because time was working in the enemy's favor while momentum was working in the Allies' favor, and momentum could be lost but never fully regained once it was gone. He estimated that with priority supply allocation, he could reach the Rhine in a matter of days, establish bridgeheads across it within 2 weeks, and be driving toward Frankfurt and the Ruhr industrial region before the end of October. The cost in American lives would be high, he acknowledged, but nothing compared to the cost of allowing the war to drag into 1945, nothing compared to the casualties that would mount up during months of static warfare against prepared German positions. Patton spoke with absolute conviction, the kind of certainty that came from battlefield success and personal courage, and his words carried weight because everyone in that room knew that he had delivered on seemingly impossible promises before. You're now at the exact midpoint of this story, the moment where Eisenhower had to make a choice that would affect millions of lives and potentially determine when and how the war would end. If you're finding value in this detailed look at how command decisions actually happened, with all the complexity and human conflict that textbooks leave out, then show your support by subscribing to the channel so you never miss our deep dives into real history. Smash that like button to tell the algorithm that this kind of content matters, and share this video with a friend, family member, or colleague who loves history or leadership lessons drawn from actual historical events. Drop a comment below about which aspect of this story you find most compelling or what detail you never knew before, because your engagement directly shapes what content we create next. Now, let's get to what Eisenhower actually said in response to Patton's demands, because his answer reveals something profound about leadership under impossible pressure. Eisenhower listened to Patton's entire presentation, and according to multiple accounts from people in the room, his face showed the strain of a man trying to balance loyalty to a subordinate he respected with responsibility for an entire theater of war involving millions of soldiers from multiple nations. When Patton finished, Eisenhower's response was not what Patton wanted to hear, but it was measured, deliberate, and rooted in strategic considerations that went far beyond what any single army commander could see from his limited perspective. Eisenhower explained that the supply situation was even worse than Patton realized, that the tonnage reaching the front lines was barely sufficient to maintain current operations, let alone support a major offensive by a single army. He pointed out that Montgomery's operation in the north had already been approved and was being prepared, that resources had been committed, and that changing course at this point would create chaos in the supply system and potentially waste the preparations already made. But Eisenhower went deeper than just logistics, and this is where his response becomes truly revealing about his understanding of the war and his role as Supreme Commander. He told Patton, in words that witnesses later recorded with minor variations but consistent meaning, that the war could not be won by a single spectacular stroke, that the German army was indeed severely damaged but not yet broken, and that premature optimism about imminent German collapse had proven wrong too many times already to base strategic decisions on such assumptions. Eisenhower pointed out that a narrow thrust deep into Germany, whether in the north by Montgomery or in the south by Patton, would create exposed flanks vulnerable to German counterattack, would stretch supply lines to the breaking point, and could result in an advanced force being cut off and destroyed if the Germans proved more resilient than expected. He reminded Patton that the Allied strategy had always been based on broad front advances that would engage German forces across the entire line, prevent them from concentrating against any single point, and systematically reduce their capability to resist through sustained pressure rather than gambling everything on a single bold move. This wasn't cowardice or political calculation, Eisenhower insisted, but sound military judgment based on the realities of fighting a still dangerous enemy on his own territory with supply lines that were already strained to the limit. He acknowledged Patton's achievements, praised his aggressiveness and tactical skill, but firmly stated that the decision had been made and that Third Army would have to continue operations with the supplies it could receive given the overall allocation priorities. The conversation grew heated, with Patton barely containing his frustration and Eisenhower maintaining the calm demeanor that had made him effective as a coalition commander, and when it ended, both men knew that their relationship had been tested in a way that would not be easily forgotten. What happened next proved both men partially right and neither entirely wrong, which is often how history actually works rather than the clean narratives we prefer. Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's northern thrust, was launched on September 17, 1944, just days before the Verdun meeting, and it ultimately failed to achieve its objectives when British paratroopers at Arnhem were unable to hold the bridge over the Rhine against stronger than expected German resistance. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army, continuing to operate with limited supplies, fought brutal battles around Metz and in Lorraine throughout the autumn, making slow, costly progress against German defenses that proved far more resilient than Patton had predicted. The war did not end in 1944, as both Patton and Montgomery had suggested was possible with proper support for their respective operations, and instead dragged on through a terrible winter that included the Battle of the Bulge in December, where German forces launched a massive surprise counteroffensive that temporarily threw Allied plans into chaos and demonstrated that the enemy still had considerable fight left. Eisenhower's caution about premature optimism and exposed flanks turned out to be justified, but Patton's urgency about maintaining momentum also had merit, because the delays of autumn 1944 did give Germany time to strengthen defenses and organize forces that would cost many Allied lives to overcome in the months ahead. The historical debate about whether a concentrated thrust in autumn 1944 could have ended the war early continues to this day, with serious historians taking different positions based on their analysis of supply capabilities, German defensive strength, and the inherent risks of deep penetration operations. What cannot be debated is that Eisenhower faced a genuinely difficult decision with no clear right answer, that he made his choice based on his best judgment of strategic realities, and that he had to deliver that decision to a subordinate who believed with passionate conviction that his superior was making a catastrophic mistake. The confrontation at Verdun reveals something important about leadership at the highest levels, about the difference between tactical brilliance and strategic responsibility, and about the burden of command in circumstances where every choice involves terrible trade-offs. Patton was a battlefield commander of extraordinary talent, a man who understood armored warfare and aggressive tactics as well as anyone in military history, and his instincts for exploiting enemy weakness and maintaining offensive momentum were generally sound. But Eisenhower carried responsibilities that Patton didn't have to consider, including the political dimension of coalition warfare, the absolute requirement to maintain supply lines for armies fighting across a front of hundreds of miles, the need to husband resources for operations that might extend into 1945, and the knowledge that a catastrophic failure resulting from overextension could cost not just a battle but potentially the political will to continue the war effort. When Eisenhower told Patton that he could not have priority for supplies, he was not rejecting Patton's military judgment so much as he was accepting his own broader responsibilities, choosing a strategy that spread risk across the entire Allied force rather than concentrating it in a single thrust that might achieve spectacular success or equally spectacular disaster. The historical record suggests that Eisenhower found this decision genuinely painful, that he valued Patton's contributions and understood the frustration of a successful commander being held back by factors beyond his control, but that he never seriously wavered in his conviction that the broad front strategy was the sound approach given all the factors he had to weigh. Patton, for his part, never fully accepted Eisenhower's reasoning, continued to believe until the end of his life that he could have ended the war in 1944 if given the resources he requested, and the bitterness of that September meeting lingered in their relationship even as they continued to work together toward final victory. This story matters today because it illustrates eternal truths about leadership, decision-making under uncertainty, and the conflict between different levels of responsibility in any complex organization. Whether you're running a business, managing a team, or trying to understand how large organizations function, the dynamic between Eisenhower and Patton offers insights that transcend the specific historical context of World War II. Eisenhower had to say no to a talented subordinate who had a legitimate case for resources, who had proven his ability to deliver results, and who genuinely believed that he was being denied the opportunity to achieve something historic. That's a situation leaders face constantly in different forms: the need to allocate limited resources among competing priorities, to balance short-term opportunities against long-term stability, to manage talented people who see only their own part of a larger picture. Patton had to cope with having his requests denied by someone he considered less aggressive and less militarily talented than himself, had to continue doing his job effectively despite believing that his superiors were making mistakes, and had to channel his frustration into continued performance rather than allowing it to become destructive. That's a situation many people face in their careers, the experience of being certain you're right while those above you make different decisions, and how you handle that situation often determines whether you remain effective or become bitter and diminished by resentment. If you found this exploration of a real historical leadership moment valuable, if you've gained insights about decision-making or learned details you never knew about how World War II was actually fought at the command level, then subscribe to this channel right now because we're committed to bringing you this kind of deep, thoughtful historical content. Hit that like button to support our work, share this video with someone who needs to understand that history is more complex and more human than simple narratives suggest, and leave a comment telling us what aspect of this story resonated most with you or what you found most surprising, because your engagement helps us continue creating content that treats history with the seriousness and nuance it deserves.